Right now, a narrow strip of water off the coast of Yemen is affecting everything from shipping costs to global energy prices. No, not the Strait of Hormuz, but the Bab El-Mandeb Strait. To break down why this waterway matters, here are two members of the American Academy of Diplomacy, former ambassador to Lebanon and U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs Jeffrey Feltman, and former acting principal deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and Middle East expert Jennifer Gavito. Together, they'll walk us through what's happening with the recent Houthi blockade, why this strait carries so much strategic and economic weight, and why the US and its allies are watching it so closely. Let's get into it.
Sure. So this narrow waterway, which, as most Americans have never heard of, sits between the Middle East and the global economy and is responsible for some 15% of global trade every year. So if the Iranian-backed Houthis follow through on their threats to close it, energy prices and the economic costs of the war with Iran are going to soar even further, drawing the United States into a much larger crisis.
Thanks for having me on, Joshua. And the Bab el-Mandeb is a global economic choke point, where a blockade will cut off 12 to 15% of global trade, meaning your energy and food prices could very well escalate with this blockade.
Can you explain what the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is and where it's located, and why is it considered one of these major global choke points?
Sure. So the Bab el-Mandeb connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. It's located at the southern entrance of the Red Sea between Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula and Eritrea and Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. So the Red Sea extends up to meet the Suez Canal, which is a man-made waterway that runs through Egypt. Ultimately, it connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean, bypassing a much longer alternative around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which generally adds about 10 or 14 days and $1 million to any delivery. The Bab el-Mandeb is only about 20 miles wide, and each year about 12 to 15% of global trade passes through it, estimated at some $1 trillion in value. As the only point of entry to the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean, the Bab el-Mandeb sits at the mouth of a crucial trade route for European-bound oil originating from the Gulf.
You could look at the Bab el-Mandeb as sort of the fraternal twin to the Strait of Hormuz. We all know what the Strait of Hormuz is now after February. And 20% of the world's energy supplies would flow through the Strait of Hormuz in normal times. Well, this is a similar thing. It's a strait, and it's all of the Asia-Europe trade goes through the Red Sea, goes through the Bab el-Mandeb. That's why it's so important to global shipping. It's not just hydrocarbons. It's 30% of global container shipping goes through the Bab el-Mandeb between Asia and Europe via Suez and the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Again, it's like a fraternal twin to the Strait of Hormuz, that it's a global choke point. Only this is a global choke point for an even larger percentage of global trade.
What happens to costs and supply chains when it's disrupted by a blockade?
That's a great question. In 2024, about 5% of total global oil and refined petroleum products passed through that route. In addition to oil and gas, about 10% of total global trade transits there, including container ships going from Asia to Europe. Saudi Arabia, in particular, has traditionally relied on the Strait of Hormuz, which is much more familiar to us these days, to export its oil. But disruptions because of the Iran war have shifted its reliance towards the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia has increased exports there by some 400% in recent months. A closure of the Bab el-Mandeb would leave Saudi Arabia and other Gulf oil producers with little or no alternatives to export their oil. That makes the uncertainty this week around the Houthi announcement that it would blockade Saudi Arabia even more dire, and that it's going to immediately impact energy markets, which have already been hit in a hard way by Iran. If the Houthis succeed in closing the Bab el-Mandeb, we're going to see prices soar even higher.
And it contributes to basically what you can call a global shipping shortage, because those ships that are going around Africa, taking 2 weeks longer each way, aren't on their normal schedules. They aren't available for other shipments. Plus, you've got 500 ships or so that are stuck in the Persian Gulf that are not able to go through the Strait of Hormuz because of the Iranian blockade of Hormuz. So you have right now a disruption in the number of ships that are available globally for shipments. Plus, your your insurance costs, and the time are all increased if you can't use the Bab el-Mandeb. Bab el-Mandeb also was a fallback for energy in a way. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that goes from the oil fields in eastern Saudi Arabia to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea in western Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia ramped up its oil production, its oil shipments through that pipeline after the Strait of Hormuz was closed. So basically, 1 out of every 20 barrels of oil used every day in the world has been coming through this east-west pipeline from Saudi Arabia. That's now being blocked. So we're losing basically one of the insulating factors that prevented the oil prices from really going through the roof because of this blockade.
So now that we've talked a little bit about what is being blockaded, let's get into the who. Who are the Houthis? What are they doing, and why have they targeted this shipping corridor?
I mean, the Houthis are a political and military organization. They emerged in the 1990s as sort of a revival movement for Yemen's Zaidi Shia Muslims. It's about 20 to 30% of the population. And they had a number of wars with the official government of Yemen. And then in 2014, the Houthis, they're officially known as Ansar Allah, which means partisans of God. The Houthis seized the capital, Sana'a. So the Houthis now control about 30% of the Yemen's territory, but they control 70 to 80% of the population. They aren't recognized as a government internationally, but they have an alliance with Iran. And so they've become part of the axis of resistance that Iran supports, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, some of the Iraqi military forces. So they're an indigenous Shia, Zaidi, Yemeni movement that has taken over a large part of the country and is now allied with Iran.
So back in 2023, in response to Israel's war on Gaza after October 7th, the Houthis started attacking ships transiting the Red Sea with drones and missiles. That threat forced shipping companies to divert around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, slowing traffic through the Bab el-Mandeb. And already we're seeing traffic that isn't back up to the pre-crisis levels like it was just 2 years ago. So this most recent threat to close the Bab el-Mandeb comes after an escalation last week between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, in which the Houthis blamed Saudi for an attack by the Saudi-backed internationally recognized Yemeni government on the Sana'a airport. Reportedly, the airplane that was attacked was of Iranian origin and may have been smuggling weapons.
So why does the closure of the Bab El-Mandeb Strait matter strategically for the United States and its allies? What's at stake beyond just shipping costs?
So the closure of the Bab el-Mandeb has really significant military and strategic implications, not just for the United States, but also for its allies. In 2023, when the Houthis started attacking ships in the Bab el-Mandeb in response to the war in Gaza, the U.S. took military action to shut down those attacks and ensure safe passage. In order to do that, again, would require diverting forces to protect free movement away from Iran and the war that's ongoing there. Leaving the United States quite thin, even as it's considering expanding its operations against Iran or trying to use force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Additionally, American naval forces transit the Red Sea to maintain agility between the Mediterranean and Asia. If the Red Sea passage were essentially closed, the U.S. would need to deploy some twice as many numbers of maritime craft to maintain coverage. This is also an important waterway for European navies who transit the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb. So it's a crucial passage all around for U.S. allies.
Energy is an important one because, as I said, 1 out of every 20 barrels of oil has been coming out of through the Bab El-Mandeb Strait or the Suez Canal from the Saudi port of Yanbu, the east-west pipeline, the thing I mentioned earlier. So you take more of the oil offline because of the Bab el-Mandeb blockade, and you have global reserves that have been drawn down since the February 28th start of the Iran war, plus the fact that China, which had sort of lowered its purchasing of oil because they had big reserves, may start up purchasing oil again, we could have a really bad oil spike. Some are predicting it could go up to $200 a barrel. I don't know. I'm not an energy expert, but that would be twice what it is currently. But beyond that, you can have a food crisis in Africa. East Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, other countries relied on trade of food, fertilizers, other agricultural imports from Europe, from Ukraine, from Russia, via the Suez, Red Sea, Bab El-Mandeb to the port of Djibouti. If that's disrupted through this blockade, you could have a real crisis, real humanitarian crisis in places like Ethiopia. 120 million people dependent on imports.
Does Iranian action in the Strait of Hormuz and Houthi action in the Bab El-Mandeb Strait set a precedent for other actors, be they state actors or non-state actors, attacking other international major waterways, thinking the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca? Is there some worry about a break from international norms?
Absolutely. One of the major concerns of the United States in its negotiations with Iran is the potential precedent that could be set if Iran were allowed to, for example, collect tolls on the Strait of Hormuz or otherwise exert its sovereignty over that. Permitting that to occur in the Bab el-Mandeb as well would just double down potentially on that precedent, causing major issues all around the world.
I think we have a real problem. Just along the lines of your question, Joshua, which is that we have stood for decades for freedom of navigation. We have provided a global public good. The United States has provided a global public good. We're a beneficiary of that global public good, but everyone's a beneficiary of freedom of navigation. And we have been basically the enforcer of that. And now we are either stepping back or being forced to step back from that role because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait Bab el-Mandeb. And when we have the administration sort of musing at times about we could charge for escorting ships, that's a step back from the freedom of navigation that we've long championed as being in our interest and in global interest. There's lots of talk about whether the procedures used in the Strait of Malacca could be applied here, where you provide some kind of service fee to the littoral countries, Oman and Iran, for some kind of services. But the bottom line is, I don't think we're going back to what was there before February 28th. I do not believe that we're going to see a return to the type of free access that people had through Hormuz before February 28th. Bab el-Mandeb, I'm not sure. Bab el-Mandeb, because of the Saudi Houthi frenemy status, I would say, may go back to more of an open thing, particularly because the humanitarian concerns of the African states would feature so predominantly if there's a permanent blockage or permanent fee-based structure. So we'll see. But there's been a real cost to the U.S. principle of freedom of navigation since February 28th.
So looking forward, what should people look for next? Why will this issue keep mattering?
So this flare-up could have a number of different outcomes. A Houthi missile strike, for example, on a Saudi or Emirati target, causing significant damage or casualties, could first of all prompt a retaliation, significant retaliation by the United States or Saudi Arabia against Iran, further escalating that conflict. And it is already clear that that threat is being taken seriously. 4 Saudi vessels have been turned around in recent days after warnings from the Yemeni rebels. So it remains to be seen whether the Houthis will actually enforce a total blockade. But if they do, then energy prices are going to soar. Supply chains are going to face even more protracted disruptions than we've already seen through the Strait of Hormuz. And a full closure of the Bab el-Mandeb would reduce global oil supply by 7% and put pressure on the already tenuous peace talks between the United States and Iran.
The real trouble, I think, in trying to deal with this matter, whether we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz or we're talking about the Strait Bab el-Mandeb, is that it's not very expensive for Iran or the Houthis to scare off shipping. You know, you have a couple drones against ships, or you threaten ships. This is not this is not a hugely expensive military operation on the part of the protagonist. Insurance companies will say, we're not insuring you, or we're going to spike the insurance rates. Shipping companies worried about their fleets will say, we're not going there. So it's an inexpensive tool that was always there, but Iran hadn't chosen to use it before, and the Houthis have used it occasionally after the Israel war with Gaza after October 7th happened. But now we all know it's there, and it's going to be very hard to forget. In fact, we won't forget that this is always possible. I think the thing to look for now is how will the Trump administration respond to this? The Trump administration did respond to Houthi strikes on shipping a couple of years ago, and there was eventually an informal agreement that the Houthis would stop targeting U.S. ships, and the U.S. would cease its bombing campaign. But it was an expensive operation on the part of the United States, although less expensive, I would say, than having the global trade disruption that closing the Bab El-Mandeb, in addition to closing Strait of Hormuz, has provoked. So the other thing I would watch are, what are the Saudi Houthi relationships going to be? It's a very complicated relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. The Houthis control the territory that's adjacent to Saudi Arabia. There had been sort of an informal ceasefire between the two, a few skirmishes along the border, but an informal ceasefire that has now broken down, and it's broken down, I believe, because Iran decided it was time to use the Houthi tool. The Houthis had an interest in not provoking the Saudis, because the Saudis have been subsidizing public servants in Sana'a, keeping the economy somewhat afloat in Yemen. But when Iran said it's time to go after Saudi Arabia too, the Houthis went along. So we need to see if the Houthis and Saudi Arabia are going to be able to come up with any kind of de-escalation or not.